Okay, can you hear me now? Can you now? All right. Okay, after that little bit of technical issues, I'd like to thank Ben for agreeing to debate and for QallOut for providing this debate space. With that said, let's look at a couple of very quick definitions to clarify the round as we go forward. Violent protest, we're going to be looking at the idea that it is a protest that is marked by the use of unusually harmful or destructive physical force or the threat of such. Peaceful protest, in contrast, is a protest untroubled by conflict, agitation, or commotion. Namely one without the threat of physical violence or intimidation or the use thereof. We're going to be looking at the vast majority rule in the context of this debate regarding whether or not violent protest does result in more positive results in a peaceful protest. In other words, like a few outskirts of a protest won't count, whether there's like some people in a violent protest are peaceful or some people in a peaceful protest are violent. We're going to be looking at the protest as a whole as it works. I urge our judges to view this issue through the lens of rule consequentialism. Rule consequentialism says that what matters is the end result of a given action. For example, a rule might be that killing is wrong, but will allow you to kill to prevent more deaths. Like if you see someone with a gun who's going to kill two people, you are allowed to kill them to prevent further deaths later on. The rule or end result we seek is a better world for as many as possible. The pro side asks that you vote for whichever side results in the best long-term world. With that said, let's look at some examples of violent protests and how they did result in more positive results than peaceful protests. Our first example is that of the Montgomery bus boycotts. This isn't one that's generally viewed as a violent protest, but it was. The situation was very simple. You probably remember the idea behind it was Rosa Parks was denied a seat in the bus and was arrested as a result of sitting down in the white area of a bus. So she didn't give up her seat for a white individual. As a result, at that time, the infant NAACP decided to organize a bus boycott in Montgomery. This was violent because it was harmful. It was directly harmful to the bus service. They lost a lot of money as a result of this bus boycott, but it very much showed the idea that, in fact, there could be social change through this violent action. It wasn't physical violence, rather it was monetary violence. Let's look at a second example. Nelson Mandela's guerrilla force. From Rolling Stone in 2014, after he died, there was like this attempt to whitewash his past, but he definitely used violent means as well as peaceful ones. For example, in the early 1960s, he organized the Umkhonto We Sizwe, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, alongside the South African Communist Party. This group bombed multiple communications transit stations and infrastructure in order to help spread this violence and help to advance his cause of ending apartheid.
Alrighty, so I've only got one. Also, cheers to my opponent for remaking the debate and everything. I've only got one contest to his definition of rule consequentialism. It seems that the way he wants to use this is to say, look, if the protest gets a good outcome in the end, then you should excuse the violence for the greater good. I would caveat that with one thing. If you could have reached the same positive outcome without the violence, then that doesn't excuse the violence in the first protest. So for this rule to take place, he would not only need to prove that the violent ends justify the means, so the ends justify the violent ends justify the violent means, but also that could not have been achieved through peaceful methods. First thing I'm going to do is address his 2 points. I guess the first thing to note about his points is that they're not really arguments in favor of why violent protests work. They're just kind of examples. And what I would suggest actually in this debate is that most protests fail. Like in the grand scheme of things, most of them do nothing. And there are going to be examples for both sides about how violent protests do and do not work. I think what would be a better way to debate this would just be look at the structural reasons as to why the features of violent protests are likely to result in them failing or succeeding. So first of all, I'll go into his thing, the bus boycott. This is obviously a non-violent protest. Like, if you can just say that any form of influence, like a monetary influence, is violence, then all protests are violent. I would challenge my opponent to give me an example of a non-violent protest if the bus boycott is violent protesting, because that means simply just standing in the street. You're causing like spatial violence to those who might want to pass, or visual violence to those who don't want to see you there. Like that is obviously a non-violent protest and one which should be considered from my side. The next one is the Nelson Mandela one, and this is where I'll lead into my points. I would ask why it was that they were whitewashed, so to say. And what I would argue is that actually, for protests to be taken seriously, they need to be given the image, or they just need to be genuinely non-violent for them to be politically palatable. And the reason for that is this: when you create your protest to be violent, it means that politicians are less likely to get on board because they do not want to be seen to be supporting violence. Because if you can imagine, there's a hierarchy of things which are politically palatable. Being in favor of an issue is politically palatable, but being in favor of the Constitution, for example, is more important than that still. And that's the same for being violent. So, for example, that is why lots of politicians say things like, as John McCain did in the Obama primary, like, I don't think my opponent is a Muslim. I just disagree with him. The idea of civil discourse above all is an extremely powerful norm. And politicians who seem to be advocating for violence against the other side don't get any traction. No one wants to vote for them. There are too many risky electorates. So that's why, and I'll elaborate on this further, but genuinely speaking, I believe that violent protests are less politically palatable and so are less likely to receive government attention, which is what they ultimately need. Pass back to you.
All right. Okay. Let's look at this idea of rule consequentialism. The idea that if it, Ben said that if it could be decided via nonviolent means, it wasn't justified. The problem is we have no way of knowing what could have happened. All we know is what did happen. You might remember that as a line of Chronicles of Narnia. And I think that, oddly enough, this fictional story works perfectly well here. In that instance, a character was asking, what could have happened? And the answer is we don't know what could have happened. All we know is what did happen or what was very likely to happen. In a lot of these situations, especially in historical context, we don't know what could have happened. Or, as in some examples, we've seen both options be tried. For example, Nelson Mandela was hardly the first Black South African to try to end apartheid. But he was the only one who was successful. Why? Because he used violent means along with nonviolent to achieve his objectives. However, those the violence is what actually allowed him to be successful where others were not. Let's look at this idea of the Montgomery bus boycotts, and namely the fact that my opponent argues that they're non-violence. Recall my definition of violence was any harmful action or the threat thereof. By definition, losing millions of dollars when people agree, like when you just stop using a service, is a harmful action. It is a violence. This isn't to say necessarily that all protests are violent. Indeed, standing in the street as a majority rule, the intent is not to create violence. The intent behind like standing in the street, for example, is not violent. But deliberately choosing, I'm not going to go on this bus, for example, which will harm someone's livelihood, is violence because it's intended to be harmful. Let's look at this idea of like the structure. The reason why a violent protest is more likely to work is for two reasons. The first one is because it's action. If all I'm doing is just standing outside holding a sign, no one's going to listen to me. There's no reason for people to change their minds. There's no reason for a government to take action unless they believe there's a threat of violence. Number two is that it is direct. You can see it happening. If 1,000 people go out and decide to march in Tiananmen Square, for example, that was a peaceful protest. Tiananmen Square was a peaceful protest that didn't work because there was nothing to back it up. In contrast, for example, let's look at something like the Boston Tea Party, where there was action backing up that sent a very powerful message, or the stamp tax riots even earlier. The difference between Tiananmen Square and the stamp tax riots, the stamp tax riots were backed up by the use of violence and the use of force. It was a violent protest, where Tiananmen Square was a peaceful protest that didn't result in any positive changes happening.
All right. So the first is that I think you're playing it fast and loose with your definitions of violence here, because at first you've said, oh, it's to cause harm, and I interpret that as physical harm, so I accepted that definition. If your new interpretation of violence is any form of harm, then that is an obviously unreasonable definition, because even like by that stage, me just not buying something counts as violence, right? Because I'm not contributing my money to a store, which is obviously like patently absurd. And then the next thing you tried to shift gears to say, oh, it was about intent, because the bus boycott people, they intended to harm the bus company. Well, I would actually probably say that that was more intended to send a message to the government, which then brings you in the really, really weird territory where, by your definition, that bus protest, some of the people there were being non-violent because even though they're doing the same thing, they intended to send a message to the government. and other people who were there just didn't want to buy from the bus. They were doing the same thing, but they were being violent, which says to me that your definition allows for two identical actions to be simultaneously violent and non-violent, depending on the intent of those involved, which is dumb, right? Like, let's just use violence in a way in which people know it to be true. If I hit you, if I physically assault you, if I do the sort of thing which the police would arrest me for and then say that is violence, right? That is what violence is: the destruction of property, the harming of individuals on purpose. That is a clear definition we can go by. All right. So that pretty much still makes the bus boycott for me. The next thing is your Nelson Mandela point. I think the most interesting thing here is that you're like, so he did both, but it was the violence which made it go through, obviously. Well, how do you know that? Like, what evidence do you have to say that it was the violent aspects of those protests which actually got him there? What I would suggest is that, in fact, what you earlier said, the fact that after the fact, the governments celebrated the non-violent parts of that protest, shows that actually the violence was something which was complicating those negotiations, and the government did everything it could in order to make that protest look non-violent in the eyes of history, so that it would be acceptable for it to pass on. Your next point, which is in direct clash with my next substantive point, was that governments need a reason to concede, and they won't concede if not for violence. What I say is that governments can concede because of democratic reasons. If all of the media is piling up behind a non-violent protest, and there's huge numbers of people on the street saying, listen, we need this, that is a strong democratic incentive to change, because you know you will lose all of those votes, and there's a lot of room for opportunism with a politician to get up there and say, I will be the one who answers your call. That is a means by which non-violent protests can create democratic incentives. On the other hand, violent protests do the opposite, because it means that governments are susceptible to messages like, we don't negotiate with terrorists, we won't be making deals with those who have hurt your property. And it also, as I will elaborate later, mobilizes business owners and private homeowners to just cast sympathy votes about, we don't care about this issue, but we don't like to be assaulted. On to you.
All right, let's look at the idea of the definition, namely that the only kind of violence that actually applies is that of physical violence. I'd actually disagree with this, because inherently, let's look back to the bus boycott, or say a riot, for example. There's physical violence involved, but the vast majority of the damage isn't the physical violence. In fact, no one could be harmed in a riot, and the damage is entirely monetary, but we still call that violence. Why? Because there was harm done to a society. Now, looking at specifically at the bus boycott, again, that's why I mentioned the idea of the majority rule, the idea that in any protest, there can be some people who are there for a violent reason, some people there for a non-violent reason. We need to go by a case-by-case basis. But again, let's look back. But even if Ben's definition is true, we're only looking at physical violence. The examples of Tiananmen Square and the Boston Tea Party and the stamp tax riots still apply. Let's look back to the idea of the structure of the structure debate, namely the idea that a government can absolutely give into a democratic protest, a nonviolent protest for democratic reasons. I have three responses. The first one is, the first and second are namely the contrast of the Boston Tea Party and Tiananmen Square. In the case of both, we're looking at an authoritarian government, not a democratic one, in which case the only possible recourse, because the other methods were tried before, was in that case violence. In the second case of Tiananmen Square, they tried a nonviolent solution, and we all know how that ended. It did not end well. Finally, let's look at my third response, which is again only in democratic societies. The only way a nonviolent protest can ever work is in a democratic society. Violent and non-violent protests can both work in a democratic society, but in an authoritarian society, only a violent protest or one backed by the use of force can work. Finally, let's look at the idea of under Nelson Mandela, namely, how do I know that this was the only reason this is successful, and why it was whitewashed? It was whitewashed because it wasn't really. It was only after his death that it was truly whitewashed by the Western nations. Recall that during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Mandela was fully aware that he could just bring about guerrilla warfare. In fact, he was doing these nonviolent protests, these active sabotages, as an attempt to stop guerrilla warfare, which he never even took off the table. So Mandela was totally willing to use violence as a means to an end to achieve his objectives, because he saw that nonviolence wasn't working. Finally, let's look at this idea of let's go back to rule consequentialism one more time, and we're looking at the long term here. We're not looking at like short-term damage or short-term monetary impacts. We're looking at the long term. What is the end result, and which side better achieves objectives? I'll admit that in a democratic society, both can work. A nonviolent means and violent means can both work. But in an authoritarian sense, only the violent means of protest actually work to create a solution.
Okay, the first thing I'll point out is rights. There is a clear difference, and I think it will be clear in audience's minds. When I don't buy a product, that is not the same as me smashing in the windows of the bus service who I wouldn't have bought a ticket from. When I smash in their windows, that is the destruction of property. That creates risk for those who would be in the bus at the time. That is clearly violence. If I'm simply not buying a ticket, that's not monetary violence. That's just my right as a consumer not to do something. And if people do, like, boycotts en masse, that's totally fine, right? That is a form of non-violent protest. If they are smashing in the windows of every bus en masse, that is obviously violent protest. Okay. The second thing I'd point out here is that my opponent has now shifted the scope of his debate to authoritarian governments, which is a wise strategic move on his part, because I think what that concedes is that within democratic governments, I am totally right. So just in a way of weighing now, I am winning most Western nations and all democratic governments. He is winning perhaps North Korea and other authoritarian regimes. What I will now attempt to do is prove that even in authoritarian regimes, that violent protests aren't going to work out that well. The first reason I'd say for that is that I actually don't think even a violent protest works particularly well in an authoritarian regime. I actually think you probably need a coup or a revolution. And I think particularly in nowadays, like ignoring the past, right? Because obviously things are different now. That weapons sophistication has gotten so damn good that authoritarian regimes are immovable even by violent protests, because just whoever has the army on their side ends up winning. Which is why actually what you need things like coups, or you need foreign intervention in order to make your protest create any results. Because authoritarian governments have no incentive when they have such overwhelming force to concede to you. What I would say is that foreign intervention from actors such as the United States is not very likely if your protest is violent, because you'll be painted as terrorists and unwilling to gain public sympathy or support. You will unlikely to be able to get foreign peacekeepers from the UN, for example, to settle things, because again, you'll be the ones who will be seen as being violent. Whereas if you are non-violent consistently, you gain sympathy in the eyes of the international community, and you're more likely to get things like aid and things like peacekeepers and things like foreign intervention. But also, that also applies to armies as well. Because if you are violent and some of your violence bleeds over into government facilities or starts to hurt members of the armed forces, then the army is less likely to coup on your behalf, because it is easier for the authoritarian leader to paint it as it is us in the army versus the people. Whereas if you are non-violent, there are a certain amount of moral consciousness from soldiers in the army who just do not want to see that potentially their mothers and brothers killed. Right, last thing on Mandela, I just think you contradicted yourself. You said he could have used guerrilla warfare, but he tried not to. But also the non-violent protest wasn't working, so he used guerrilla warfare. Like, this is like, let's just admit it. There was a bit of both. My contention is that the bits which were non-violent were the most effective.
All right, let's begin with let's go in reverse order. Let's look at first at Nelson Mandela. What he did is he kept guerrilla warfare as an option on the. Oh, that's a cute cat. He kept guerrilla warfare on the option on the table as an option, and he also used means at the exact same time. He didn't fully escalate just to full-on guerrilla warfare. He was using violent protests and things like sabotage, but he didn't go full-on and just say, let's write it. Let's just go full-on for guerrilla warfare here, because there's a difference between violent protest and guerrilla warfare. I think there is a distinction there. He didn't commit fully to guerrilla warfare, but he kept it on the table as an option. Let's look at this idea, namely that violent protest, that monetary violence is by definition nonviolent protest. When you're looking at like an intentional, we're going to deprive this company of resources and we're going to cause harm to that company, that is violence. Causing harm to something is the very definition of violence. But even if that isn't the case, the idea that I never said that that violent protests don't work in a democratic system. In fact, my whole point of the Montgomery bus boycott was that it does. But even if that is true, there's other examples as well, such as Malcolm X or the Kent State riots, where we've seen this violence being used in America, in probably one of the most democratic nations on earth, and it's being used, and there is a result at the end. But again, let's look at the other examples, namely the Boston Tea Party and Tiananmen Square, two completely contrasting things. Both of them were under authoritarian governments to some degree, and in the case of the Boston Tea Party, they said, okay, we've tried nonviolence before, we've tried we've tried everything, we've petitioned Parliament, and yet they still keep this tax, so instead we're just going to violently protest now. In the case of Tiananmen Square, they said, we'll have a nonviolent protest, and that did not end well for any of the protesters. But looking back to this idea, namely that in a authoritarian government, you can nonviolent means can work. Let's just look at a couple examples of this actually working. There's not many. In the case of an authoritarian government, we just don't see that happen. It's more likely you're going to see the violent results, such as the Arab Spring, or cases where a violent protest is needed, because authoritarian governments, they have no reason to concede to a nonviolent protest. Only the threat of force is sufficient to actually cause them to rethink what they're doing. Let's look at a further example of this. In East Germany, you might remember, right towards the end of the Cold War, East Germans decided, no, we don't want this wall anymore, so we're going to tear it down. Obviously, the East German government at the time was authoritarian, and they wanted to try to stop that, but it was only through the actions of East German people, namely violently going and tearing down the wall, that anything was actually done. So in this case, I think we can clearly see that while in the cases of a democratic society, there might be some leeway, and you'll get results from both. In the case of an authoritarian government, the only way to actually get results is by violence.
Okay, so first thing, I just want to pass the mic back to ask you a question. Say, for example, if you go down to the store to get a snack and you've got like McDonald's and Chick-fil-A, and you choose Chick-fil-A, are you being violent towards McDonald's?
I would argue that yes, I am actually being violent towards McDonald's, because I'm intentionally harming them monetarily for some reason. If it's just a personal preference thing, because I don't like have a malicious intent, yes. But if I like want to, like, as I said, like want them to bring back Szechuan sauce, for example, yes, it would.
I like the Rick and Morty reference. Okay, next question, I promise is the last one. If you're like walking down the street and there's just like a passerby and you don't give them your money, are you being violent against them?
It's like not giving someone who needs help my money. I'd actually argue that, yeah, I'd actually argue that it does depend, whether it's just, but again, like in the case of like, we can't really look at it on an individual basis. We need to look at it in terms of like the whole protest.
So what I challenge my opponent to do is come up with any example of a non-violent protest. Because at the point where even just not giving a passerby money could qualify as violence, then what the fuck am I supposed to do to protest without somehow impeding on somebody? Even by this definition, it's like, unless you are on the street with all of your belongings, just handing them out, then you're committing violence all over the place. And I'll leave that for the judges and audience to decide. The next thing you're talking about was, let's just go through a couple of your examples. Tiananmen Square. I actually reckon that actually in some ways this did actually make a big difference, because that was the one which generated that famous photograph of like the girl standing in front of the tank, and that did put huge amounts of international pressure on China, and they have been way less violent and authoritarian since. So I would actually argue that in some ways, even though the result isn't like the obvious overthrow of the Chinese Communist Party, it did actually positively change their actions. But also, I question my opponent. Why do you think violence sort of worked? Do you reckon like if the girl was holding an AK and like firing at the tank and watching the bullets spray off its armor, that it would have been better? As I said earlier, which received no response, authoritarian governments nowadays have such overwhelming force that even if the citizens went violent, they wouldn't be able to defeat them anyway. Next thing is about East Germany. I just think his facts are a bit wrong here. My recollection of the East German Cold War end is it's not like the people rose up and tore the wall down. It was that the US continually dropped supplies into West Germany, such that the East Germans just gave up on the idea of supporting East Germany. And then, like the speech was given, and the people, tore down the walls like a ceremonial thing. It was not really a violent protest. This was kind of like a victory party. The Arab Spring, again, the Arab Spring just didn't end up working, right? Because they got their election and then they immediately ousted, the army who was supposedly on their side immediately ousted those who got elected, which was the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's not really a great example of violence working. Okay, look, let's just look at the structural factors. What I told you is that in a democratic system, you can still mobilize democratic support in a non-violent way. What you run the risk of doing when you do it in a violent way is politicians say things like, we won't negotiate with terrorists. Politicians can't be seen to be violating higher virtues of civility and non-violence on the streets. Business owners will mobilize, right? Because when their property has been damaged, they will say, listen, we don't care about this issue. We need our shops to not have their windows smashed in. And you get lots of individual instances of people being harmed within the violence. You also get the whole narrative of Blue Lives Matter and people being violent against cops. And what all this does is it obfuscates the issue. It makes the issue not the protest, and it makes the issue the violence, which is when politicians can get a lot of points just from making platitudes about non-violence as opposed to actually engaging with your issue. When you have a non-violent protest, that vulnerability isn't met. In an authoritarian regime, I referred you to my earlier points about how you actually need sympathy from international actors in order to change things nowadays, and that is not gained through violence.
All right. Under the idea of what constitutes nonviolence versus violence, again, we're looking at and malicious intent. And inherently, it's let's look back to the very first speech where I said my definition was one that's marked by the use of usually harmful or destructive or use of or the threat of a usually harmful or destructive physical force. Inherently, like not giving a homeless man money on the street, for example, that might not be malicious. But let's assume that Ben's point is right. That the only kind of violence that we're looking at is that of physical violence, right? Let's just simplify it, all right? Let's just simplify down to the idea that the only kind of violence is physical violence. What do we still have? We still have the example of the Tiananmen Square, for example, versus the Boston Tea Party. In the Tiananmen Square, there might have been small forms and changes. In the case of the Boston Tea Party, it sparked a little thing called the American Revolution. You might have heard of it on occasion. It's a rather obscure point of history, I'll admit. But inherently, like we see this idea where in authoritarian societies, the main reason to get changes is via violent action. In the case of democratic societies, I freely allow protests work just fine, but they aren't the only thing that works. We've seen, for example, in the case of the Kent State riots and Malcolm X, we still see this violence or the threat of physical violence that still work to create social change. Or in the case of Nelson Mandela, again, we still see that change. In a democratic society, using violent means doesn't prevent you from achieving any objectives, nor does it necessarily guarantee that they'll happen. But in an authoritarian society, the only way that you'll be guaranteed to get change, for the most part, is via the use of force. For example, I would even argue that in the case of Tiananmen Square, my opponent said that, there's that international pressure afterwards. There's that threat of violence from international sources to China. You need to conform. Granted, it wasn't from their citizens, but there's still that outside threat of violence that works to make these authoritarian governments re-question their decisions. But in the case of China, we won't ever know if a violent protest will work because there really hasn't been one. In China, we haven't seen that violent protest actually ever happen, but we have seen those violent protests happen in other places. So just to summarize, I think that PRO is winning at this point for three reasons. First, that it's the main reason, violence is the main reason that we see social change in other structures, in authoritarian structures. Second, we can absolutely see these social changes in democracy. And third, and finally, it has a positive effect as well. I grant that nonviolent protests do have a positive result at the end, but violent protests have a more positive result. One, because there's actually action taken, and second, because it works in authoritarian governments better.
The thing I'll point out is that his earlier thing about saying, look, they both kind of work is obviously not the debate. The debate is which one provides more positive results. What I'll point out is that the overarching theme of his example bashing is that he hasn't provided any structural reasons other than there's violence, so things must change, which would lead you to believe actually that you could take all of his results and imagine all of his examples and imagine a world where they were non-violent and the results would have been more positive for the reasons which I've given, which I'll rehash now. The first thing I'll do quickly though is analyze this definitional point. I think my opponent has wasted a lot of time trying to convince you that examples like Rosa Parks count as violent protest because that it is monetary violence. He never answered my challenge which he gave in my first speech, which was to name a form of non-violent protest via this definition, which was why he gave it up in his last speech. Ultimately, if you were just boycotting something, that is a non-violent protest. That does not count as violence, which is why a lot of these examples, like Rosa Parks, actually are victories for my side, because if she, for example, instead of just sitting in the back of the bus, started shooting all the people in the bus or smashing the bus's windows, I would guess that she would get less political sympathy. And what is the reason for that? The reason is my first major point of contention. Governments cannot seem to be negotiating with terrorists. Are susceptible to pressure, for example, from business lobby groups and also from just people who get hurt in these violence protests who say this isn't about the issue anymore. I just want to feel safe in my streets, which obfuscates the issue. It makes it not about the protest issue, it makes it about the violence, which is why lots of these violent protests get derailed and don't produce results. Where I think his case was at its strongest was in the context of authoritarian regimes. What I would say here is to first of all ask yourself, do you think that that protesting to change governments is a debate which is more likely to be applicable to democracies or authoritarian regimes? I would say democracies hold a lot more of the world's population, more of the world is striving to be a democracy, and so that is where the focus, the impact should be weighed. But even in the authoritarian regimes, I think I still win. Why? Because by his own concession in his last speech, he said that in the Tiananmen Square example, you need the threat of violence from outside. From outside, it's no longer violent protest, that is international intervention. That is other actors like the UN or the US intervening militarily in your country. The US does not intervene on behalf of terrorists. The UN does not intervene on behalf of terrorists. If you are violent, you'll be painted as a terrorist because you are using violent actions for political ends. When you are just civilians, when you are the girl versus the tank, that garners the sympathy and the international intervention, which we both agree.